Hello and welcome back to Jimbo's PC Builds. So to jump in quickly at this point, the video was delayed. Originally it was supposed to be out like 4 or 5 months ago, around the time of the review of the case, the Lian Lancool 205 mesh. For various reasons, which I've highlighted in my channel update, I wasn't able to do that. So some of the things I'm going to say in the introduction and some of the things I'm going to say in my conclusion are out of date now, especially around the part selection. Parts you could buy at the point in time when I actually did the build is not necessarily true today. Also, the build itself I sold quite considerable time ago, so it isn't available on Facebook, etc. All right, with that said, let's continue on with the video and hope you enjoy it. Today I'm going to do another build video. Today I'm going to do a build that, you know, in the current times with the pandemic and all the shortages, may be more of a viable option for you. The parts I've got behind me are new, but they are readily available on eBay, and relatively speaking, they're available at a reasonable price. They're still overinflated for what they are, especially the GPU, but the likes of the CPU I'm going to use is you can still buy it new from certain places like Micro Center. So I thought what I'm going to put together is something that if you wanted to build a gaming PC right now, that you could. Alright, so in the video I'm going to first of all walk you through the parts that I'm going to put in it. Then I'm going to do the build montage and I'm going to talk through putting the parts in. And it's not going to be a build guide, but I'm going to try and cover all the parts you need to know from a general user if you're going to do a build in the machine. But I'm also going to do a review of the case, and I'll link that in the description below at a later point once that video is ready. If it's not come out before this, but it'll be a review of the Lancool case I'm using in it. Alright, without further ado, let's have a look at the parts. So the parts I'm going to put it in are an AMD Ryzen 3700X, which is a last generation CPU, but it still performs very, very well and is still great for gaming. I'm going to put on that a Thermaltake Contac 12, which is a temporary cooler for now. I'm going to replace that with the Thermaltake UX200, which from what I've seen is a little bit more attractive than this cooler, but I'll be covering that cooler in a future video. I'm also going to go with the ASRock B50 Steel Legend. The Steel Legend motherboards are supposed to be very good, so I can't wait to work with that. I'm also going to stick on some Trident Z memory. I'm going to go with 16 gigs rated at 3200. The Trident Z memory is really good because it's got great RGB, looks very attractive, and also the RGB is easy to control in pretty much all motherboard software, so it's a pretty decent memory. With that, I'm going to pair it with an EVGA 2070 Super Black Edition. It's a pretty decent GPU. I know it's last generation, but it'll play pretty much every game at 1080p and pretty much most games at 1440p. They're going to go in a Lancool 205 mesh, which I'm going to do a review of that case in line with this build, so you'll be able to watch a review specifically of the case. The power supply is going to be a 750 EVGA BQ. It's not a modular power supply, but still a pretty decent one and should do well. I'm going to put in for storage an inland 512GB NVMe drive. Inland is the Micro Center in-house brand, but you know it's still a pretty decent NVMe drive and should perform very well. And I'm going to team that up with a Team Group 1TB hard drive, which is an SSD, and that will be used for storage in games. Alright, there's the parts, let's move on. As always, I'm going to be doing the build on top of the box that the motherboard came with. It's a nice and easy way of doing things, and I find it really useful. Especially when it comes to installing the CPU. Don't forget when you're installing the CPU to make sure you're putting it in correctly. Line up the 2 dots on the motherboard, or alternatively the Ryzen, when you put it in, it should always line up with the top of the CPU slot, so you can see where the arm is and you can see the top of where the solid block is. So if you put it like this, where the Ryzen lines up with it, you'll be good to go. You put it in and it should nicely drop in, and then put the arm down. After that, I'll put the memory in. Remember when you're putting memory in to put it in the right slots, because you want to make sure that you're utilizing dual channel. So I'm going to put it in the slots. There we go, there's the first and there's the second slot. I think that's channel A or channel B, I can never remember. But if you put them in those slots, it will make sure it'll utilize dual channel memory for the motherboard. Because if you put them together, they'll be in the same channel and you won't get as good a performance. So doing it this way, make sure that you've got great performance out of your memory. For putting thermal compound on, I use the P method. In this case I'm using some Noctua CPU thermal paste, which I've found to be really good. And the cooler I'm putting on, it's okay to install this cooler, but as you can see I'm having to put quite a bit of effort to get it clipped on. But once you do get it clipped on, it's pretty stable and doesn't go anywhere in a hurry. Now I'll put the CPU cooler on without the fan purely because it was easier trying to struggle with the fan already being on. So what I'm doing is I'm putting the fan in place and I'm attaching one of the arms on one side. And I always bring it on with the one arm already installed because it's easier, and then I attach the second arm. It can be a little bit fiddly to get the arm into the holes, and then you've got to try and get the arms so they line up. They go in the right slots within the fins on the CPU cooler, and also you don't want your CPU cooler fan at a bit of an angle, so you can have to sit and play with it a little bit. But you know, it's worth it because once you've done that, you know you've got the fan on right, it doesn't hit the memory, etc. So putting the fan on second not only makes it easier for cooler installation, but it also makes sure that everything sits exactly where you want it to be and you're good to go, like so. Next you have to connect up the CPU fan. I always try and make sure when I put the CPU fan header, it's closer, the cable is closest towards the header, so it's easier to put in. Next I'm going to put the NVMe drive in. This motherboard comes with a nice NVMe cover, so I'm going to take the first screw out and then I'll take the second screw out, because you need to make sure the cover's fully off before you put the NVMe drive in. There we go, taking the second screw out. Once the cover's off, you have to make sure you peel off the film that's covering the cooling, which is on the cover, because that'll keep the NVMe drive nice and cool when it connects to it. Now when you're putting an NVMe drive in, you have to make sure that the little mounts where the end of the NVMe sits on, like you can see here, I'm pushing it down and it would line up. Normally you would put an NVMe drive screw in there to hold the NVMe drive in place, but with this cover you don't have to, and I chose not to, so I'm just putting the NVMe drive in, and then the cover itself, once it's screwed down, holds the NVMe drive in place. So the good thing is, I use the iFixit kit because they've got magnetic screwdrivers. You just basically put the screw on the end and then you just screw it in. It makes life nice and easy. Put one screw in, and then once I've finished getting rid of dust, cleanliness is key and all that kind of jobby, not sure why, but anyway, but there you go. Then you get the second screw in. Even if you get a bit of a wobble, you can just reset and put the screw in. Now when I tried to put the motherboard into the case, again making sure the cable's tucked in, I was trying to put it in and I couldn't get it in because the the case fan at the back was in the way. So what I had to do was I had to take the case fan, the back case fan out. So you had to undo all 4 screws. The first couple of screws are easy. Well, the first 3 screws are easy, to be honest, because nothing moves. So there's the third screw coming out now. There we go, there's the third screw. But when you go to undo the 4th screw, obviously the fan starts to move. So you have to be careful that when it becomes loose, that you grab it so it doesn't drop or gets damaged in any way. And then you have to make sure that once you take that screw out, you pull it out. And you can see all of the cables have come away. Now I'm able to just slot the motherboard in, making sure that the cover on the back lines up so it sits in nicely. And there's a standoff in the middle of the case, so the motherboard sits on that metal standoff so it doesn't move anywhere. And then put your screws in. I always start with the screw in the top right hand corner because that stops the motherboard from moving, and it also stops any wobble on the CPU cooler, etc, etc. So that's a nice screw to do, and then do the rest. Next I'm just threading the CPU cooler cable through, so I'll be able to cable manage that later, and it's out the way and it makes life easier being out the way. Next I'm going to put the cooler fan that I took off back on, because once the motherboard was in I was able to get it back on no problem. It's just slotting it in, I wasn't able to do that while it was there. Next I'm going to take off the back covers for the GPU so it can slot in. Now, when you're doing this, I was aware of which ones I had to take off. If you're in any doubts, you can always get the GPU and put it like you're going to put it in so you can see which covers you have to take off. This GPU cooler is only a two slot cooler, so I only had to take 2 covers off. So there you go, I've loosened them and then pulled the things out, and then I pull the covers. Now I'm slotting the GPU in. As with all GPUs, you have to give it a bit of a push because it will click into the socket, and the click at the end will make sure that the GPU doesn't go anywhere, so you have to give it a bit of a firm push. Then once it's in, you then have to take the screws that you use to take the covers off and put them on to make sure that you secure the GPU in place, like so. There we are. Next on my list, oh, dropped a screw, was to put the SSD on the SSD mount. So I took the SSD mount off the case, which was really easy because it just a screw in a slot. And then I was screwing the SSD onto the little mount kit, which is just taking 4 screws and screwing it in from underneath. It was nice and easy. It's an easy mounting system and it's pretty consistent with all cases, so it's something you should be familiar with if you've built a PC before. And then once you're finished, you just slot it back in and put the screw in place, like so. There we go, and that's the SSD in. Next, I went to put the power supply in. So I moved a lot of the cables out of the way, thinking about what I was going to attach to where, etc. Thinking about cable management at this point. But I was thinking what space I needed underneath for the cables for the PSU, and did I need to move the drive tray, which I didn't need to in the end. So I went and got the PSU and went to put it in, and I immediately spotted a problem. The SSD that I just put on was too low, so I wasn't able to slot it in. So what I had to do, as you've guessed it, take the SSD back off again so I could then get the PSU into its nice little home. Once I'd taken it off, I was able to slide the PSU into place, and there we have it. Now, because this is a non-modular power supply, all the cables are already attached, so I didn't have to worry about attaching any cables before sliding the PSU into place because they're already there. Once I slid it in, then it was a case of getting the 4 screws that you have supplied with it and making sure it was firmly attached to the case because you don't want it to move. There's the first screw, there's the second, etc, etc. There we go. Just tighten them up to make sure. Now I'm looking at the points, and you can see they've got the 24 pin and the CPU power pins, so I'm making sure from the front to the back where I'm going to need to pass the cables through. So here I'm passing the 24 pin cable through, so that's your main power cable. That's going through at that point because that lines up to where the slot is on the motherboard, like so. For the CPU power, I was able to see how many of the cables I need, because some can be different number of pins than others. But I saw that I need all of them, so I passed it through, like so. And I was able to turn it round and plug the 24 pin cable in. And I was also, with a little bit of difficulty, able to plug the CPU power in. The CPU power cable can be a little bit tight to plug in because it can be split into 2 parts. You've got to keep those 2 parts together and then plug it in. Now for the GPU, I was actually putting extensions on that, so I was putting 2 extensions, one through each power socket. So I was passing the extension through first, for the first one, passing it through, and then attaching it to the GPU for the second, and I put cable combs on later to make it a little bit more attractive. Now we're back at the back again. I was able then to put the SSD back on. Hooray! So with the PSU being fully in and the cables passed, I was able to put the SSD back on. Very nice. Next I was attaching the USB. Now on the USB, this I think is USB 2, this one, there's a little notch on one side which lines up to a notch on the socket. Now when putting this on, be very, very careful because it's very easy to bend the pins. So you have to line it up, make sure it's lined up, and then push it in until it's nice and snug. Like that. So next, onto the cable management. You can see here I've already attached the CPU power cable and threaded it through using the cable tie points, which looks very attractive. So next I've got to start worrying about other cables as well. Now the fan I took out is obviously disconnected from the controller, so I'm looking at which is the best way to route it. And it looks like the best way to route this cable, because of the length etc, and that I can do, is the same point as the CPU power is. So I've put the cables that way, and now I'm connecting them back up for both the RGB and also for the fan controller, plugging them in, and then I'll be able to either disconnect the attachments there, or just as I did, add a couple more cable ties, and voila, it'll be nicely tied up. So just routing it there, and then use cable ties just to attach it to that cable, like so. So next you've got to worry about all the other cables. Now you can see here I've attached the SSD cable for the SSD and passed it through to the motherboard, so I've done that already. Well, once you've done that, now you need to start bundling up cables, and then bundling them together, tying them together, and then using the cable tie points to actually keep them nice and tightly tied into the actual case itself. So here I'm bundling them up, passing it through a tie point, and then zip tying them together. Now the problem I had with this case is the fan controller they put in is right where a cable point was nice and easy to use, so I had to move further over to a cable tie point, which kind of looked nicer because obviously all the cables are pushed out the side and you can see the fan controller, but it did make managing the cables a little bit more difficult. But in the end, I think, you know, the cable management didn't turn out too badly. And there we are, there's the finished result. So that was the Lancool 205 mesh build. I think it came out really nice. I'll put some B-roll up now so you can see how it looks. I think the final build is impressive. I went for a red theme on it because, you know, I put some red cable extensions in there. Well, the red and black, but it's got red in there. So I set the lighting to red, which was very easy to do using the ASRock lighting software. I just connected the devices in the ASRock software and set everything to red, and it all went immediately because I was able to connect both the fan controller from the case and everything else, and it even picked up the memory, and it all came up in the software, and I was able to set it really, really nice. So I'm very, very pleased. As always with all of these builds, I will be selling this on Facebook and Letgo, etc. In the days of COVID, it's a bit more difficult, so if you're interested, please keep an eye out on the Facebook page. I'll be linking it there. I'll also be linking it on the Twitter account and probably on Instagram as well. So keep an eye out for that if you want to buy this machine. It's pretty decent. I'm very happy with how it came out. All right, I've not done a build video for a while, so I hope you like this. I've done a review of the case that went to the build as well. I'll link that in the video description down below. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon for future content, which I'll hopefully do some builds if I'm able to in the old COVID and pricing, etc. To be fair, it might be a while for one, and if you're frustrated by the lack of being able to do builds, I'm sharing in that frustration because I'm pretty much in the same boat. But that'll do it for now, and as always, take care.